The Soviet Union was one of the most powerful nations of the 20th century, with an economy that stood as a direct challenge to capitalism. Its leaders claimed that socialism would surpass capitalism in wealth, equality, and innovation. For decades, the Soviet economy was held up as proof that a centrally planned system could rival free markets. But by 1991, this once mighty economy system had crumbled, leading to the collapse of the Soviet Union itself. How did the Soviet economy work and why did it fail? In this video we'll explore the foundations of the Soviet economic model, how central planning shaped industries, agriculture and everyday life, the cracks that appeared over the decades, the key events that led to its collapse in the late 20th century. By the end, you'll understand not only how the Soviet economy operated, but also the lessons it offers for economic systems today. The Soviet economic system was born out of the 1917 Russian Revolution, which overthrew the Tsarist regime and brought the Bolsheviks to power. Led by Vladimir Lenin, the Bolsheviks envisioned an economy free from the inequalities of capitalism. They believed that wealth should be owned collectively and managed by the state for the benefit of all. Lenin's early economic policies, known as war communism, were extreme. The government seized control of all major industries, redistributed land to peasants, and requisitioned grain from farmers. While these measures helped the Bolsheviks win the Russian Civil War, they caused widespread famine and economic collapse. In 1921, Lenin introduced the new economic policy, a temporary retreat from pure socialism. It allowed some private trade and small businesses, which revived the economy. However, after Lenin's death in 1924, Joseph Stalin took power and implemented a much more radical form of central planning. Under Stalin, the Soviet economy was built around 5-year plans, blueprints for industrial and agricultural production set by the state. Private property was abolished, and the government controlled all resources. Factories, farms, and banks were owned and managed by the state, with production targets determined by central planners in Moscow. The goal was to rapidly industrialize the Soviet Union and make it self-sufficient. This system produced some impressive achievements, such as transforming a largely agrarian economy into a global industrial power. However, it also set the stage for many of the problems that would later lead to the Soviet Union's downfall. Central planning meant that the government made all economic decisions. Instead of supply and demand determining prices and production, these were set by bureaucrats. Heavy industry, such as steel, coal, and machinery, was prioritized. The Soviet Union became a global leader in industrial output, producing tanks, airplanes, and other goods that helped it win World War II and compete in the Cold War. However, consumer goods like clothing, appliances, and cars were often neglected, leading to shortages. For example, while the Soviet Union could produce advanced military equipment, basic household items like soap or shoes were often hard to find. Long queues became a daily part of Soviet life as people waited hours for goods. In agriculture, Stalin implemented collectivization, forcing peasants to give up their land and join collective farms. The government believed this would increase efficiency and provide more food for the growing urban population. Instead, it led to widespread resistance, famine, and millions of deaths, particularly during the Holodomor in Ukraine in the 1930s. Even after Stalin's death, Soviet agriculture struggled. The rigid planning system couldn't adapt to local conditions, leading to chronic food shortages. By the 1980s, the Soviet Union was importing grain from the United States to feed its population, a humiliating failure for a supposed superpower. While the Soviet Union achieved some remarkable technological feats, such as launching the first satellite, Sputnik, and sending the first human into space, Yuri Gagarin, innovation was often stifled. Without competition or profit incentives, there was little motivation for individuals or businesses to improve products or processes. The lack of consumer focus also meant that many Soviet technologies lagged behind their Western counterparts. For example, while the US was developing advanced personal computers in the 1980s, the Soviet Union struggled to produce basic electronics. The Soviet economy began to stagnate in the 1970s and entered a full-blown crisis in the 1980s. Several factors contributed to this collapse. The central planning system was inherently inefficient. Bureaucrats often set unrealistic production targets, leading to waste and poor quality goods. Factories would produce items that met their quotas but were useless in practice. For example, a shoe factory might produce thousands of left shoes without any right ones. Without the possibility of profit or competition, workers and managers had little reason to work harder or innovate. The system rewarded meeting quotas, not excellence or efficiency. The Soviet Union relied heavily on oil and gas exports to fund its economy. When global oil prices dropped in the 1980s, the country's revenues plummeted. The Cold War drove the Soviet Union to spend a huge portion of its budget on the military. While the US could afford this due to its larger, more dynamic economy, the Soviet Union couldn't keep up. The rigid system encouraged corruption and the growth of black markets. Many Soviet citizens relied on these illegal markets to obtain basic goods, further undermining the official economy. In the 1980s, Mikhail Gorbachev attempted to reform the system with policies like perestroika, economic restructuring, and glasnost, openness. However, these reforms only exposed the system's weaknesses, leading to greater instability. By the late 1980s, the Soviet economy was in free fall. Factories were shutting down, food shortages were worsening, and public dissatisfaction was growing. Gorbachev's reforms failed to revive the economy, and instead they fueled political unrest. In 1991, the Soviet Union officially dissolved, marking the end of a 70-year experiment in central planning. The collapse was not just economic but also political, as the Communist Party lost its grip on power and former Soviet republics declared independence. The transition to a market economy in the 1990s was chaotic and painful. Many Russians saw their savings wiped out, while a small group of oligarchs became incredibly wealthy by acquiring state assets at bargain prices. The Soviet Union's economic collapse offers important lessons. Central planning has limitations. While it can achieve rapid industrialization, it struggles to meet the diverse needs of a modern economy. Incentives matter. Without competition and profit motives, innovation and efficiency are difficult to achieve. Diversification is crucial. Relying too heavily on one resource, like oil, makes an economy vulnerable to external shocks. While some argue that the Soviet system had strengths such as universal education and healthcare, its inability to adapt ultimately led to its downfall. The Soviet Union's economy was a bold experiment that promised equality and progress, but ultimately collapsed under the weight of its inefficiencies. Its story serves as a reminder that no system is perfect, and even the most powerful nations must adapt to survive. What do you think about the Soviet economy? Do you believe it was doomed from the start? Or could it have succeeded with better reforms? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into the world of economics and history.